Is it the case after one babysitting episode you returned him to his mother with a black eye, inside leg bruised and a grazed face?
Nah, did not happen.
Did not. Never returned him with a black eye?
Nah.
His Aunt Katie says that you shut him up in the hall, turned off the lights and locked him there when he cried too much.
I don't think that ever happened, you know.
This is a true crime channel, so I just want to give you a warning that the following contains graphic content that may be disturbing to some audiences and that viewer discretion is advised. This is the story of JAIDYN LESKIE. He was 13 months old when he went missing on the weekend of the 14th and 15th of June 1997. Unfortunately, his body was found on New Year's Day at Blue Rock Dam, which is only about a 17 or 18 minute drive from Maui, where this all took place. It has been almost 22 years since this crime occurred, and nobody has been brought to justice for it. If you followed the Casey Anthony case from 2008, then you will find a lot of similarities here. Let's start with this story by talking about Belinda Murphy, JAIDYN's mother. Belinda is one of 3 kids. She has a younger brother Glenn and an older sister Katie, who later on started going by the name of Katie instead. She grew up in an abusive home, which probably explains why Belinda tolerated abuse around herself and her children, even though there is not much evidence to suggest that she herself was violent. A lot of us that didn't grow up with domestic violence probably can't understand that, but I guess we're not in her shoes and we didn't grow up in them. It's not an excuse, but it is just an observation of the facts. Belinda's older sister Katie was dating a guy named LESKIE, who she met at a drunken party. Katie was pregnant when she got back together with Brett after yet another one of their tumultuous breakups, but she wasn't pregnant to Brett, even though it's entirely possible that he thought he was the father. In fact, I think he did. They stayed together long enough to get married and give birth to a daughter. The marriage lasted less than a year, largely in part because Belinda was now living with the couple and had started having an affair with Brett. Not long after the affair started, Belinda got pregnant with their daughter Brianna. The affair continued and Belinda got pregnant again in 1995 with their son JAIDYN, who was born on the 30th of April 1996. Brett and Belinda soon broke up and Brett moved to Western Australia. When JAIDYN turned about 1, Belinda started dating a guy named Greg Domasavage, who was a Maui native. He had lived there all of his life. Greg also grew up in a pretty rough home and flouted himself in the face of authority, but Belinda continued to date him anyway. He seemed to be interested in looking after JAIDYN several times, not so much her daughter Brianna, but he seemed to prefer teaching the boy manly things like fixing cars and playing Nintendo, even though JAIDYN was only 12 months old. This is how the timeline begins on Saturday 14th of June 1997 for little JAIDYN LESKIE. Around mid-afternoon, Greg dropped Belinda and the kids off at Katie's house to get ready for a party that the girls were going to go to that night. They already had a babysitter for Brianna, Belinda's daughter, and Katie's 2 children, but Greg had offered to look after JAIDYN and Belinda told him that he could. Sometime in the late afternoon, a neighbour said that they heard Greg scream and that it was a noise that they had never heard come from him before. Shortly after that, they saw him hosing down his driveway, even though it was raining. Belinda says that between about 5:30 and 7:45 that evening, she tried to call Greg about 20 to 30 times, but he didn't answer. She had expected that Greg would have returned JAIDYN to the babysitter who had the other 3 kids. At 8:11 p.m, a neighbour called Greg's house to see if he wanted to come over and smoke some bongs with her. This time he answered the phone, but he declined the invitation, saying that he was looking after JAIDYN. At around 10 p.m, Greg called that same neighbour back to ask if they had any spare nappies, even though Belinda had packed 4 in with JAIDYN's bottle and some clothes for that night. A little before 11 p.m. that night, the party group with Belinda and Katie moved to the nightclub at Ryan's hotel. At around 11:10, Belinda tried to call Greg again, and this time he did answer as well. He said that JAIDYN had fallen against the heater and burnt his bum. Greg further stated that he had taken JAIDYN to emergency at Maui Hospital, but they didn't do a good enough job, so he drove JAIDYN to the new Maryvale Hospital. At this point, of course, Belinda wants to go home. She's drunk and confused, but Greg talks her into staying at the nightclub. About 10 minutes later, at 11:20, Katie decides to call Greg, and he tells her that they have been to the hospital. JAIDYN fell against the radiator and burnt his bum. The hospital put cream on it. He's fine now, don't worry about it. So Katie returns to the drinking group, and Belinda remembers her saying that the burn was all a joke. Katie has refuted this, saying that she would never make up a sick joke like that, but regardless of what was said, they continued to drink at the hotel for a few more hours. At approximately 12:30 a.m, one of Belinda's neighbours hears and sees Greg's car parked across the street at her house. At approximately 1 a.m, the neighbour who had invited him over to smoke bongs said that she had heard his car start up, and she said she knew it was his car because the sound of the motor was very distinctive. It's around about this time at 1 a.m. that a fight erupts at the nightclub and everybody gets kicked out. At around 1:30, 2 o'clock, Katie orders Belinda to call Greg and ask him to pick her up. Greg leaves to pick Belinda up at about 2:15 a.m. It's about a 20-minute drive to where Belinda was drinking, and he arrives there to pick Belinda up at about 2:35 a.m. On the drive home, he points to the new Maryvale Hospital and tells Belinda that JAIDYN is there. However, in June 1997, the hospital was still being built and had not even been opened yet.
You said to her when you were bringing her back from the hotel that he's in hospital, is that right?
No, when she asked again, like that's when she said, "Where's Jay?" Sort of thing. And I just, pointed across the road, and that was basically it. Yeah.
Dishonesty.
Why did you tell her such a ridiculous lie?
Oh, I know. What can you say? I'm just retarded at times. It was the most stupid thing I've ever said. What can you say now?
It was just one of Domasevich's many contradictions and backflips that confounded investigators.
They arrived back at Greg's house a little after 3 and immediately noticed that his front windows are smashed and that there is a severed pig's head lying on the ground in front of the windows. The back door was bolted and the front door was locked as Greg had left it. There were no signs of a disturbance inside, apart from the shattered glass and a few rocks that had been thrown from the outside. The hole that the pig's head had made was clearly too small for anyone to enter or exit from either. Okay, this is where we pause the story for a moment and where I tell you about the pig's head crew. Let's start with Yvonne Penfold. Yvonne used to date Greg before he started seeing Belinda, and as a matter of fact, they slept together just 2 weeks before JAIDYN went missing. Of course, Belinda and Yvonne didn't have the best of relationships because of this, and were known to call each other names when they saw each other in the street, or to play practical jokes on each other, like putting dirt or sand in Yvonne's petrol tank. It was widely reported that Yvonne had been abused by Greg. She regularly had bruises, cuts and abrasions all over her body. Greg was very violent, and Yvonne's brother Kenny was obviously not happy about the way his sister was being treated. Kenny, Yvonne and a few others were at a different party on the night of the 14th of June and started talking about a plan to get back at Greg for the way he was abusing Yvonne. This is when they came up with the idea to get a severed pig's head and throw it at Greg's front windows. They sent one of their friends, Tubby, out on his bike to retrieve the head from the bush, which he did. He came home, put it in a bucket of water at the front door, and then went back to bed. Yvonne, Kenny and a few other people then left the party and switched cars and drivers over so that Yvonne, who was the soberest, was driving. In the car with her was her brother Kenny and two friends, Darren Wilson and Dean Ross, a guy they simply called Dum Dum Dino. It is reported that Yvonne let them out near Greg's house at 2 a.m, which is about 15 minutes before he left to get Belinda from the nightclub. The Pig's Head crew didn't immediately go to Greg's house. Yvonne drove them to a railway siding down a dirt track behind the local BP service station on Narracan Drive. Kenny and Darren got out of the car, but some common sense belied Dum Dum Dino's name as he stayed in the car with Yvonne at the wheel. Kenny and Darren sat in the bushes opposite Greg's house and kept watch for about 5 minutes. They noticed the boot on Greg's car was open and then witnessed Greg come out of the house, throw something in the wheelie bin and then go back inside. They were shocked when about 5 minutes later, Greg again exited the house, put the boot down, hopped in the car and drove off. Kenny threw the pig's head at Greg's front windows, but it bounced off without breaking the glass. He picked it up again and threw it for a second time, this time hearing his success as the glass smashed into a million pieces. Kenny then started throwing ballast stones he had picked up from the railway tracks at the unbroken windows. Darren, spooked by all the noise being made, ran off, with Kenny Penfold not far behind. Greg and Belinda get back from their drive just after 3 a.m, and at 3:09 a.m. Greg made a 17-second call to Yvonne, screaming down the phone and asking if this was another one of her sick jokes. He never mentioned in this call that JAIDYN was missing. During this time, Belinda briefly falls asleep for about 10 minutes until Greg wakes her at about 3:20 and tells her that he has decided to take her home to her house on Lincoln Street. After dropping Belinda off, Greg is pulled over by the police at 3:35 for a licence check and random breath testing. He satisfied the requirements of these and was allowed to go, but he didn't mention anything to the police at this time that JAIDYN was missing or even the pig's head in his front yard. Belinda calls Greg after this, reminding him not to stay in his house alone because of what happened, and asks him to come back to her house, which he does. When he gets to Belinda's house this time though, he seems panicked and agitated, telling Belinda that JAIDYN is missing and that they had to go to the police station. Belinda at this point is still really drunk, she's tired, confused, because she thought JAIDYN was safe at the Maryvale Hospital. Greg and Belinda arrive at Moe Police Station at about 5 a.m, and Greg tells the officer on duty that he had left JAIDYN sleeping at home while he went and picked his girlfriend up at a party, and when he got back, JAIDYN was gone and there was a severed pig's head in his front yard. And so the investigation begins. That brings us to the end of part 1, guys. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button below and then the bell that comes up next to it so that you are notified when part 2 is up. In part 2, I will talk about the investigation, the trial, the evidence, and the 3 inquests. You heard it, 3 that followed.